like to introduce our next speaker, Susan Wu. Susan is really a serial entrepreneur. She's going to run through in a minute all the jobs and companies she has founded and companies she's worked for, which is in a pretty amazing group of companies. But back in 2000, she had co-founded a company called Opus 360, which IPO'd for $600 million on NASDAQ. Was it NASDAQ? There's a good story around that. We're going to tell that story. So welcome to Susan. We're going to sit here and talk. So Susan, we've just had Poppy, who's 14, talk about her passion for a sport. You left home at age 15. Tell us about why you left home and what you were doing.
Yeah, I loved hearing Poppy's story, although, to be honest, she's a lot smarter and a lot more enterprising than I was at that age. But I was also a competitive figure skater, and so I had spent many of my early years waking up at 4 a.m., going to the ice rink and training with Olympic coaches, and essentially going through some of the same processes of trying to raise $24,000 a year to fund one's competitive skating. Unfortunately, in those days, there wasn't the internet. It was much harder to turn your hobbies into viable businesses. But I did end up leaving home at 15 for entirely different reasons, although possibly related reasons, in that my parents weren't really well equipped to parent. And so I ended up going to live with my grandparents for my 15th year, and then in my 16th year, I went off to university, to a small liberal arts university in Boston, which is as far as I could go from California at the time. And so sort of started off the rest of my life essentially making very foolhardy, risky decisions, kind of blindly, as it were.
And how did you get from figure skating to tech? What was the first thing you did in tech, and what was the journey from figure skating to tech?
Oh, I think I started off as many kids today start, which is, essentially being a disgruntled teenager and thinking there has to be something better than what is around me, and going online and hanging out at the time, which were on dial-up bulletin boards, and essentially just learning how to hack on things. And so I entered university. I worked as a systems administrator at the local university network. And then from there, I ended up dropping out my senior year. So I was like a pioneering early university dropout. Went back to California and started working in a long series of different kinds of tech roles, all the while starting up businesses on the side, different kind of web consulting businesses. But essentially, I have done almost every role you can imagine in tech. So from systems administrator to network protocol designer to program manager, product manager, to game designer, game producer, to venture capitalist, to investment banker and research equity analyst, to co-founder, and then now today, I'm heading up and managing director of Stripe for Australia and New Zealand. But throughout that whole journey, have essentially touched every part of the tech world and tech business, and it's been pretty fun.
Awesome. Let's start with Stripe, because I know there's a lot of startups out there who use Stripe. Perhaps you could, for those who don't know, I think there will be just a few who don't know what Stripe is, explain what it is, and explain, I think, why it's important for the startup ecosystem and how it helps it.
Yeah, so essentially Stripe's mission is to increase the GDP of the internet. So it sounds very lofty, but if you think about it, over 80% of the developed world today uses email or web communications or mobile communications on a daily basis to transact information with each other. But only 3% of the world's GDP takes place online today. And so sometime, we don't know how many years from now, but probably within the next 30 years, 100% of the world's GDP is going to be online. And most of that is going to be fostered by entirely new businesses. Businesses started by people here in this room, businesses that you're seeing on stage today. And all of that growth is going to come from innovation and entirely new ways of thinking about products, services, customers, and industries. And the reason why Stripe exists is to make all of that happen much more easily and much more instantaneously than was ever possible before. So in a similar way to AWS and how AWS has made it possible for essentially a startup to get started instantaneously, and also WordPress in the same way that WordPress makes it easy for a company to have a web presence and to have infrastructure for their content instantaneously. Stripe makes it very easy for you as a small business or you as an emerging startup to accept payments from anyone, literally anywhere in the world, instantaneously.
Fantastic. So we're going to talk about a few mistakes now, and particularly early days. Let's start with Opus 360. Can you tell us the story there and how you came to list with a $600 million valuation?
Yeah, well, so those were the days. So this, you have to remember that this was the period between 1998 and 2001. I mean, this was really the Wild West days. And I mean, every single tech conference that I go to these days, where people are sharing their wisdom and learnings about how to run a business intelligently, all of those learnings came from having seen it done very poorly during that period of 1998 and 2001. And I would say that our business, Opus 360, made almost all of those mistakes ourselves. So, for example, the business was essentially a freelancing platform business. So there were two parts of the business. There was software that we sold to enterprises to help them manage their workforce and to manage, projects and contract labor within that workforce. And then there was a product called freeagent.com, which is very, very similar to freelancer.com today, or Envato, or 99 Designs today. Essentially the mistakes that we made was that capital was widely available in that era, right? It was basically pretty easy if you were relatively technically and business savvy to raise I think we raised about $50 million before we went public. And on the back of a book of business that was maybe about $50 million in run rate revenue, list on NASDAQ at a $600 million valuation. And so I think the key learnings from that era were just that, obviously, you don't want to be entirely beholden to capital, but you do have to keep a bottom. There's no business if you're not managing your cash flow, right? I mean, you don't have a viable business if you're burning through $3 million a month and you don't have a predictable book of revenue to cover that. So. Can
you talk about the period of time between first founding that business and listing? How long was that?
I think it was only 3 years.
3 years? And how many people did you have working for you when you IPO'd?
When we IPO'd, I think it was a couple hundred people, so probably 250 to 300 people.
Okay, so there's we work with a lot of startups, but I don't know of any startup in Australia that's built a team of 300 people in 3 years. How do you build a team of 300 people in 3 years?
So another great failure story was immediately before that company, I had worked at a company called US Web. I was one of the first 30 employees of US Web. US Web is essentially sort of like wanted to be the McKinsey of internet consulting. So it was like a Razorfish or an Organic. It was a very large-scale internet consulting company. And I was one of the first 30 employees of that company. And within 5 years, that company, through acquisition, had grown to 11,000 employees.
Wow.
Yeah, so that's yeah.
So how did you hire 300 people in 3 years? Did you use recruitment agents? How do you suck up that many people?
I think the key learning from that period is that, and this is what we, in all the companies I've worked with since, so most recently I've worked with Twitter, Square, Obvious Corporation, Medium, Stripe, and Reddit. And I would say that the key learning from that entire period is that there's nothing more important than hiring well. Yeah. Sometimes that means hiring very slowly. And sometimes that means, like, for example, at Obvious, where I was a founding partner, I think we interviewed probably a couple of hundred of design candidates over a period of 1 year before we finally hired our first designer. And so for that whole first year of the company, there were no designers, right? There were a dozen programmers and no designers. And so every prototype that we handed in was not very attractive and not very optimized. But on the other hand, we were very, very deliberate. We did not want to compromise by hiring the wrong person just because we needed someone to fill the seat. And so I think that, and I've also been a very active angel investor, and whenever I hear a company talk about, we just 10x'd our team in a year, or we just, hired 20 people last month, it's always a big red flag. It demonstrates to me a lack of understanding of culture and a lack of understanding of how organic team collaboration happens. And so I would never, ever make that mistake of trying to hire too quickly.
What do you think is a good hiring versus people who stay rate? Like, there's a lot of stories in the startup ecosystem that you hire 10 people and you end up keeping 3 or 4 of them. Is that true, do you think, or what do you think's about right?
I would say 7 out of 10 sounds like sounds more accurate to me in terms of for sure within the first 4 years of a company. Obviously, you're going to make hiring mistakes, and also usually if you're a first or second time founder, you don't always know exactly what you're looking for, and also when you're hiring for an early stage startup, most of the roles that you're hiring for are so loose and so poorly defined that sometimes, the great generalist that you thought you were hiring who could just be really scrappy in the first 6 months ends up not really scaling to a more structured organization in 2 years' time. But 70% sounds about right to me.
Okay, we've spoken about the first few hires. Let's talk about founders. I know that you've seen a lot of founders. You've worked with some of the world's best founders, the most famous founders. People like Ev Williams, and you tell me what for you makes an inspirational founder.
Yeah, well, I guess so I have to confess my bias is towards working with founders who are very product-oriented. And so everything I'm going to say is geared towards that particular type of founder. And the distinction is that there are product-oriented founders where product differentiation and product quality really distinguishes the likelihood of success for your business. And then there are operational founders where sort of understanding either a channel or a manufacturing process or a deployment process is the critical piece to success. So for product founders, I guess if I think back about all the founders I've worked with, like Jack Dorsey or Katerina Fake or Ev Williams and now Patrick and John Collison, what I'd say is that there's a really, really good balance between intuition and analytics. All of them sit on that continuum, but all of them sit on the continuum of being very, very intuitive decision makers. And that can be really frustrating, actually. So, often when you work with Ev, he's not a proactive communicator. He's a very intuitive thinker. He's a very intuitive, what I mean by that is he has a vision in his head of the product that he wants to build. Sometimes it can be communicated externally to other people. Sometimes it cannot be. And so working with the product founders is sort of a much different kind of proposition than working for an operational leader. But essentially the kind of trait that I'm looking for, do these people have kind of a unique vision and understanding about the world? Have they arrived at these conclusions through first principles? And first principles are really thinking about the basics of human behavior or the basics of human civilization or the basics of why do we work? Why do we want to transact? What is the foundation of capitalism? These very, very basic building blocks of how you end up making conclusions about your product these first principles are the kinds of things great founders spend a lot of time thinking about.
And how important is it to be a tech founder, to be able to build that first product yourself? We've heard quite a lot about tech founders. Being able to do that capital light is really important.
Yeah, I was giving, so a woman basically cold emailed me on LinkedIn the other day, and I took her call, and she was essentially leaving her job in management consulting to start a new startup. And she asked me this very question. She said, I'm not a technical founder. I don't really have programming skills. Is it possible for me to hire an external consulting firm to build my product? My gut reaction is that it's possible, and one could possibly succeed, but your chances of success are much, much higher if you have hands-on knowledge of your product, your users, how your users are interacting with that product. One of the principles that I always talk to when I'm working with founders and CEOs of consumer companies is, what is that internal unconscious relationship that your user has with your product? For example, when I wake up, am I thinking about Twitter? When I wake up, am I thinking about Facebook? When I go to bed, what product am I thinking about? Is this product essentially represent a best friend relationship for me? Is it a relationship of convenience? What exactly is the tenor of that relationship? And I don't think you really understand that unless you have really deep hands-on knowledge of the product and how your users are using it, because you need that user empathy. So.
Great. I know you have a view about sort of industry news, and in the last 5 years, there's just been an explosion of startup industry news, and we all feel compelled to read it every single day. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, so I used to read industry news religiously, especially when I was a VC, because it was really important to essentially understand what everyone else is funding to some extent. But now that I'm saying it, it actually sounds really wrong. I mean, I'm confessing that today I actually never read industry news, and I try not to pay attention. I really go out of my way to not pay attention to what other people are doing, and to not pay attention especially to what possible competitors are doing. I find that it just creates noise. I mean, I think really great founders and really great leaders, they know what they're going to build, right? I have a really good vision for what needs to be done over the next 3 years, and to some extent, what my competitors are doing or what the rest of the industry is doing might kind of marginally impact that on a short-term tactical basis, but certainly not change the long-term strategy or change how I'm thinking about product roadmap, or more importantly, change how I think about what users really need at the end of the day, or what our customers are feeling, or what their pain points are.
I think we're all happy to hear that, because it's physically impossible to read all the startup news every day. Tell me about,
it can make you crazy too, right? I mean, every day there's someone raising more money, kind of getting more press, and...
Well, that's a good... Tell me a little bit about jealousy in Silicon Valley, because it seems to me that there are these businesses that just sort of pop up out of nowhere, and I've heard stories of it being quite a sort of... There's a lot of jealousy around in seeing someone next to you who's not as smart as you, doesn't work as hard as you, suddenly having this great success, and you're toiling away.
Well, I think that's life, right? Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, so let's talk about the Silicon Valley as a meritocracy myth for a second. To some extent, Silicon Valley is a meritocracy in the sense that your startup is going to live or die by, how well you do, how well you perform, how well you hire, especially, how good your team performs together, whether or not you've timed the market right, and all of those different concepts. And almost all of those are within your control to some extent. But what we don't talk about is people are born with different kinds of attributes and assets and resources. And so, I guess to answer your question, yes, probably. I mean, it's a very competitive community, right? People care quite a bit about trying to be the best in the world. But I think the very, very best founders don't really pay attention to that noise. The very best founders couldn't care less what, that so-and-so made, $2 billion overnight, within the last 3 years by, selling their company to Google or Facebook, because they have their own mission and they have their own vision. And as I mentioned before with not paying attention too much to competitive news, that mission is set in stone regardless of whether or not someone says no to them, whether or not someone is succeeding in front of them or more aggressively than they are. All of that is sort of irrelevant compared to the drive to deliver something that they have seen, some vision that they have seen in their head.
We've spoken about kind of good things, good founders, really successful founders. I think you've got a story with Ojai, perhaps about a founder relationship that didn't quite work out.
Yeah, so Ojai, I would say that, so Ojai essentially was a gaming startup that I started in, I think it was 2008. I had very lofty dreams of bringing essentially, Nintendo-style games to the web. Mario Kart or Legend of Zelda in a web environment. We built great technology, but ultimately we didn't deliver a good enough product. We ended up getting something like 1 million users, but it wasn't enough. And anyways, gaming is a terrible business to be in unless you really, really love it, because it's a binary business. It's like Hollywood, either you have a hit or you don't have a hit. And then once you have a hit, having repeatable hits is a very, very, very hard prospect. But I think as I think about it and analyze all the different mistakes that I made in running that business, the very first mistake was in the choice of co-founders. Whenever someone asks me, what's the key to Jack Dorsey's success, or what's the key to Ev Williams' success, or what's the key to Patrick and John Collinson's success, I think ultimately the success of any startup comes down to making 1 million decisions well. It's little iterative decisions, and you might not be perfectly correct on all million of those decisions, but you want to have a pretty good hit rate, right? You want to have a pretty good hit rate of, say, like above 80% correct on most of your decisions. And the key to getting all of that right is really in the founding team, meaning the chemistry of the founding team, whether or not you trust your partners, whether or not you guys can communicate well together, whether or not you have good complementary skill sets, all of those ultimately cascades into kind of the actual tactical decisions that you make over time. And with Ojai, what ended up happening was that I founded the company with 3 other co-founders, all of whom looked amazing on paper. One of them had been the studio head of Sony Online. One of them had essentially invented Facebook games, but put us all together and we weren't a great team. And that was any other decision I made after that point didn't matter. That was the kind of the big failing decision.
I'm going to remind everyone to be typing away on their phones. Put some questions into Slido, guys. Okay, we're going to talk now a little bit about Australia versus Silicon Valley, and you're allowed to be controversial. Tell me.
I'm still waiting for my citizenship here, so I don't know how controversial.
There's no one watching. Tell us about what you see. Let's start with founders and their ambitions. Do we have big enough ambitions here compared to Silicon Valley?
Well, I already know I feel like you're trying to get me to say what you want to hear.
Because
having been to all the Blackbird StartMate events in the last year, I know what your position on this is.
Yeah, we're trying to get people to think bigger. Come on, give us the line.
Well, I'll put it this way. The only kinds of businesses I like to work on are businesses that could potentially touch 1 billion people. I don't know if that makes me ambitious. I don't know if that makes Silicon Valley people more ambitious, but there's a certain scale and breadth. Like, I feel like, you live once. If you're going to live once, you might as well do some big stuff. And I think that probably a lot of people in Silicon Valley have that same mindset.
Are you seeing it here?
More and more so, yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, like, for example, Canva, safety culture.
Big fan of Canva, big fan of safety culture.
And I think they're both your investments.
They are. Funny that.
So I see a theme here, which is you guys like to invest in founders with big ambitions.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Great. Let's talk about engineering teams here in Australia, because I have a view that it's actually easier to start a great engineering team here in Australia than particularly Sydney, Melbourne, but it's starting to happen, I think, in Brisbane. And a few other places, but particularly Sydney, Melbourne. In Silicon Valley now, it is so difficult to hire good, high-quality engineers. They tend to run off. They get poached really easily. Whereas we seem to have a growing pool of engineers who are entering the startup ecosystem here that mean you can build a great engineering team here. And I think Canva, for me, is a standout team. I think safety culture as well. How do you feel about engineering here in Australia?
Yeah, I definitely agree. So it's been actually really fun building the Stripe team here in the region. I have interviewed, over 1,000 candidates in the last year. And I would say that the people that we're hiring, for example, we hired someone who had an aerospace engineering background. We hired someone who had a mechanical engineering background. I'm very keen on one candidate I'm talking to right now that has a physics background. And so I think in terms of raw science and engineering, there's extraordinary talent here. And I think possibly there's a gap between applying that raw engineering and sciences talent to, say, software development. But it doesn't matter, because software development can be learned if you have good foundation in analytical frameworks and logic. And so I think that without a doubt, there are great people in all of the engineering disciplines and science disciplines here who could become great software engineers.
I'm trying to open Slido here. Here we go, here's one. So if you have a founder, I assume by poor founders, what's meant is founders that aren't working out. How do you move them out of the team? And what if they have equity? How do you deal with that?
Yeah, no, it's a really, really hard question, and one that I only know somewhat of an answer to because I did it completely wrong the first time. So when we started Ojai, as I mentioned, we had 3 co-founders, all of whom had equity. I mean, I assume that anyone who's a founder has equity, so that's kind of a non sequitur, or tautology, I guess. It's a very hard issue and is actually the most common issue for startup failure, which is founding teams breaking up and then not knowing exactly how to dissolve the founding team. Because what ends up happening, I guess the first thing I'd say is if you know that you have a problematic relationship with your co-founder, you need to fix it immediately, because what happens is the more people that you hire, the more the toxic relationship spreads to the rest of the team and infects the rest of the team and kind of constrains the growth and potential of your overall startup. And then secondly, how do you remove that person? Honestly, there's no great answer to this. Sometimes it can be non-contentious. Sometimes it's a matter of just sitting them down, having an adult conversation and saying, hey, this isn't working out. How do we split the equity of what's already been earned and what's going to continue? Sometimes you have to enlist your investors to do that on your behalf. Sometimes your investors are great allies for you. Sometimes it becomes litigious. I mean, there's no great answer other than if I were to do it all over again, and this is kind of advice. So for example, one of the things that I did early on at Square was when Jack was starting up Square, I helped advise him on some of the legal frameworks and on some of the capital structure and the equity structure of the new company because of some of the difficulties he had had at Twitter. And basically, the advice is, have a really good startup lawyer at hand, structure the voting agreements, the board agreements, and the equity agreements in such a way that allow you to retain some control of the company, even if you have to get rid of co-founders. All of that can be done through essentially the board structure and the voting rights of the company.
And founder vesting in shareholders, how important is that? Super important?
Oh, of course. Yeah. I know you're asking this because you know the answer to it. You just want me to say it.
I could say it, but it's better if you say it.
So founder vesting, the way it usually works is really good new investors are going to enforce this, and they're going to enforce it for a good reason. And what they're going to do is say, hey, you guys have been working together out of your garage for 2 years, but now that we're putting new money into the business, we're going to restructure, essentially the capital framework of the company, and you're going to be on a reverse vesting schedule, which basically means that all the stock that you currently own, you're going to earn a little bit over the next, anywhere from 3 to 5 years. And that's for the protection of the founders as well as the investors. And it's actually a good idea. For any of you who have ever given up, more than 10% of your company to a founder and didn't have a vesting schedule in place and the founder eventually left, you know how painful it is to eventually have to hire employees or have to grow the company without having access to that equity and having essentially this overhang of a retired founder who does nothing but drag down the morale of the team.
When I talk to founders, they say their biggest regret often is not putting vesting in for themselves and for their team, because they're inevitably left with one or two that don't work out and own a big chunk of the company but don't do anything. Okay, so here's some more questions from the floor. One is, do you think it's better to develop skills across business areas or to hire those skills? Have you seen a combined product and operational founder?
I was reading the Twitter stream. I wasn't here earlier this morning, but I did read the Twitter stream of the Sunrise Conference earlier, and I think Juiced from Eventbrite said something like this, which is, double down on your strengths and hire for your weaknesses. And so that's my answer as well, which is, I think for a long time throughout my career, I thought, well, I really need to mitigate for my weaknesses. I really want to be strong in all areas. And admittedly, today, I am decently strong in many areas, but maybe not like extraordinarily strong in one area. And I think great founders are really, really, really strong in at least one or two areas, and they mitigate for their weaknesses in the other areas. And that actually has some implications. So what I just said also implies that you have the emotional intelligence to be able to self-assess objectively and accurately for where you're weak and being able to hire for those people.
Okay, so this one's been voted up 8 times, so we're definitely answering this one. So this is from Seb. In a world where PR is overtaking newsworthiness, what are your thoughts on playing the game as a key to the funding, marketing, and growth of the business? I assume this means not focusing as much on PR, but focusing on just delivering and executing on your product. Or how important is PR?
So I'm thinking about this question because I've definitely made this mistake in various incarnations in the past in different ways, and I'm trying to think about how to summarize this. So when I was the founder, when we founded Opus 360, and when I was the founder of Ojai, the gaming business, we definitely made this mistake, which was to believe the PR to some extent, but also rely so heavily on PR that that we overlooked basic principles around customer acquisition, kind of customer lifetime value, the ongoing survivability of the business. I think PR is a huge distraction. Like if I were to do it all over again, what I would say is today, PR is generally a huge distraction. You want to get press because people are coming to you because you're building a great differentiated product and because you have a unique value proposition and because your vision is interesting. You want people to be beating down your door, not the other way around. And so I think PR can help a little bit in kind of creating some uplift around, say, fundraising and large-scale partnerships at some point, so corporate partnerships. But, I mean, for the first 3 years of a business, I think it's kind of overvalued.
So here's one that I guess touches on corporate partnerships. If you have $1 million customer, but that customer wants to take you away from your vision, do you do it or stay focused?
Oh, it really...
I'm assuming $1 million is a lot in your early days.
I think it really depends on the parameters of that question. So, for example, does that $1 million customer require, does that shift in focus require you to hire people that aren't really part of your core business? Does it require you to essentially stop building your core product and build a side product? Does it require you to kind of change how you think about distribution strategy? If those things are true, then I would be less excited about diverting resources away from your core business to focus on that user. On the other hand, that user can help fund ongoing operations, as many people on the stage have pointed out. And so it's really kind of a judgment call, like how diversionary is that particular customer, or any of the people that you'd have to hire for that particular product line reusable in your core business, so on and so forth. Like what percentage of the engineering work is also relevant to your core business, stuff like that.
And sometimes it's okay to say no, because I have a great, one of my favorite stories from one of our portfolio companies was a big Australian corporate, started using their product and called the founder down to Melbourne to meet with them. And as soon as the IT team found out that it was written in the cloud on the Google App Engine, the IT team said, nope, sorry, nothing on the cloud, we cannot do it. So the founder, they said, oh, well, you're going to have to rewrite this on Oracle inside our firewall. And the founder took a deep breath and said, no, sorry, and went home. And 3 months later, there were 3 times as many people using that software inside the business, so they called him back again. Yep. And this time they said, okay, we can do that, we can handle the cloud, but you've got to sign this thick 60-page enterprise software agreement. And he turned around and said, sorry, here are our 3-page standard terms and conditions. And they're now paying him many tens of thousands a year.
Yeah, I think I think your story reminds me of something that we have to decide at Stripe every day, right? Like, so for example, there are many very large corporate customers that we could service, but the whole sales process, the whole sales cycle of servicing those customers is very different than our core competency today. And so I think implicitly, we often make the decision of, focus, like, those customers will be there if our product is good enough in 3 years, and we're going to wait for them until our product is there, because otherwise it would compromise the integrity of their organization, which then compromises everything else about what's making us successful today.
So this one, we've had a few questions around this, and this one's been voted up a lot, and I'm sure you get asked this a lot, but as a female entrepreneur, how do you feel about gender barriers in the industry? How do you feel about the efforts to change that?
Well, I guess, so I ran a conference in Melbourne last year called Above All Human, and we deliberately set out to ensure that 50% of the speakers were women, and they were. It was a tech conference very similar to this one. And I think that, I don't even know how to answer that question. Yes, of course, there are gender differences and barriers to women succeeding in the startup world. There are gender differences and barriers to women succeeding in life generally. It's a personal passion of mine to try to level the playing field, not just for women, but essentially all underrepresented minorities. I think about the reasons why I got into tech in the first place. Tech for me, when I was a teenager, going on BBSs was this sort of great utopian vision of technology that would enable us to communicate much more effectively with each other, perhaps humanize us in different ways, perhaps reveal parts about our characters that weren't easily discernible in kind of more structured, normal, everyday world encounters. And now today, I'm really excited to be working on businesses that help essentially level the economic playing field so that a startup founder working out of their garage in Queensland can easily sell to corporate businesses in the US. And I think women as part of that continuum are extremely important because if you think about where all the GDP growth is going to come in the future, women are one of the great untapped resources that will help drive that expansion.
Okay, so we're going to move on. I want to ask you in the last 6 or so minutes we have a little bit about two of the sort of more recent companies that you've been involved in. The first being Obvious Corporation, which turned into Medium. Can you talk a little bit about that process of how Obvious was founded and how you came up with the product and the first couple of years of that? Yeah,
so even though Ojai was kind of failing, and there's nothing, I mean, any startup founder knows that if your startup has been failing for 4 years, it's a pretty dire, it's a pretty emotionally draining life situation for you. And so kind of towards the end of Ojai, we started looking for acquirers, and we talked to a number of acquiring partners, and there were businesses that were interested. But I also just randomly kind of pinged Evan Williams, who had been an old friend of mine because I had been an early investor in Twitter, and he mentioned that he was starting to leave Twitter, and he was leaving Twitter with Biz Stone and Jason Goldman, and did I want to come by and brainstorm some ideas with them? And so I went by. At that point in time, they were working out of one of Ev's kind of spare apartments in the Mission, and it was like a 2-bedroom apartment, and everyone was just hanging out in the living room. And I went and hung out with them for a few afternoons, and we would just started batting around ideas. And it emerged that we didn't know what we wanted to build, but we knew that we wanted to work together. So I ended up being the first employee and essentially the founding partner of this new Obvious Corporation thing, which was essentially like an incubator. And so Ev and Biz and Goldman and then also I brought on 3 of my team members from Ojai to this new company. And so we would all sit in the living room and hang out in Ev's apartment and basically talk about new product ideas. And I think Medium didn't really start emerging. Well, I guess I'd put it a different way. So Ev has always had a passion for content platforms and communications tools. So that has always been his passion. But at the time, we were also experimenting with other ideas. So he also had a passion for things like time management software. He was very obsessed with time efficiency and kind of mortality, immortality, and using one's time on Earth effectively. We were also very interested in the idea of killing email forever, right? Like essentially email is incredibly inefficient. So we didn't quite know what we wanted to work on. And then and Goldman had the idea that he wanted to, possibly, start kind of a new kind of content journal, not dissimilar from like the Monthly here in Australia. And so we knew we had this giant bucket of ideas. We didn't really know which one was going to succeed. And so we started, the process that we ended up with was essentially just starting to hire engineers. So I managed our hiring process. We ended up hiring, as I said, maybe a dozen engineers. And we broke those engineers up into like little teams of 3 or 4 people each. And each engineering team got to propose an idea, build a prototype, and like essentially pitch it to the company as if, is this something that we want to work on as a whole? I think Medium started off as one of Ev's side projects, and it was essentially like he had a new idea for how he wanted to see content displayed on mobile devices. And that kind of coalesced with like Goldman's idea of like wanting to create a really interesting, high-quality literary journal, or like kind of political literary journal. And all of these things just started kind of circling around each other, and it became Medium.
Fantastic. So that's one story, and then I guess to kind of compare that perhaps to the early days of Stripe, yep. Which, there seemed to be such a mission there, perhaps, the opposite of not knowing quite what the product was and then having a kind of real mission for what the product should be. Would that be a valid comparison?
I think John and Patrick Collison are really unique founders in the sense that they have extraordinary clarity. So in the earliest days, Stripe did start off much more modestly in the sense that, they were startup founders. They had previously sold their startup. I can't remember exactly what kind of startup it was, but they had sold it for, say, $5 million to another larger entity, and they were looking for new startups to start, keeping in mind that they were still in university at the time. And what they realized in building these new prototypes for new startups was that it was very, very difficult for them to accept payments, that actually building the product was easy, accepting the payments was hard, and that seemed to them, in 2009 to be insane. Like, in 2009, hasn't, the business of online payments already been solved? And the answer was actually no. It still remained incredibly difficult for startup founders to accept payments, and also, more importantly, to preserve a very, very high quality of user experience, and especially across mobile. And so I think the evolution of Stripe started off as, essentially a product that they and their friends wanted to use, and their friends happened to be other technically minded startup founders. And then it grew from there. Essentially, it grew because the founders themselves would come back to John and Patrick and say, well, have you thought about this feature? And so almost all of the early product, I would say, was driven quite a bit by kind of user feedback, which goes back to your earlier question of, is it advantageous to have a very hands-on relationship with your product? Even today at Stripe, even though we're a much, much larger company today, I think if you tweet at Stripe, there's more than a 50% chance you will get Patrick himself answering your tweet.
That's amazing. Well, look, we're out of time.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Susan, for being with us
Thanks
today
very
and
much.
sharing your stories.
Okay.
Cheers.